The United States is experiencing a crisis in manhood. On average, men and boys are falling behind in education, income, employment, and other social and economic measures. Brookings Institute fellow Richard Reeves argues in his book of Boys and Men that our institutions, from our schools to our economy to our culture writ large, are no longer effectively serving men and boys, and that men in particular are being left behind by a changing society. I agree with Reeves that men and boys are falling behind. The data don't lie. But I disagree on why. I argue that it's not that our institutions are failing men and boys, but that men in particular are adamantly refusing to change with the times. It only takes a few clicks on social media and YouTube to see that men are acutely aware that we're losing ground. But instead of responding with self-reflection and good old-fashioned hard work, like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, we are overwhelmingly responding with tantrums, pouting, finger-pointing, and mansplaining. In many ways, the crisis in manhood is also a crisis in parenting. While these men likely cannot be saved, we still can save our sons and other young men and boys. But we are facing an uphill battle. Our children are being pressured to be connected to the digital world 24/7. At the same time, as social psychologist Jonathan Haidt observes, parents are increasingly keeping their children indoors in order to protect them from alleged dangers outdoors, and screens and technology are becoming the distraction of choice. Meanwhile, the actual dangers lurk in that digital world. For instance, our boys and young men are being shepherded from banal and innocuous videos about working out in sports cars to the vitriol of the manosphere, a den of celebrities, media personalities, influencers, and so-called men's rights activists and incels, all of whom villainize women, blame them for their own shortcomings, and in some instances, even promote violence against them. Our tech companies are radicalizing our young men and boys and warping their understanding of what masculinity is. So what should we do? Well, not always a model of gender equality and inclusion, I think we can look to our past for some potential solutions. Manhood has evolved for centuries, millennia, globally. And I think that 3 examples could help us with some solutions. First, there's chivalry, which can best be seen in the French chivalric romances like Mort le Roi Arthur, and the British chivalric tales like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Tristan and Isolde. Through these tales, men and boys learned the values of chivalry, honor, bravery, piety, and courtesy. And while men and boys didn't always live by these ideals, it gave them something to strive for, a moral compass, if you will. Chivalry would have a renaissance centuries later in the form of the Victorian gentleman. Like the medieval knight, the Victorian gentleman was honorable, polite, and brave. And the Victorian landed gentry often felt a sense of noblesse oblige, or the duty to provide for those who are less fortunate, like the poor and the infirm and the elderly. In other words, the Victorian gentleman felt an obligation and duty to their fellow humans. The Victorian gentleman would go through a further evolution in the first half of the 20th century, especially during the 2 world wars. The gentleman became the warrior who fought fascism, acted heroically and bravely, and as the British said, kept calm and carried on. This is the era of the greatest generation, and some of the most revered men in our history: Eisenhower, Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, Pershing, MacArthur. We lift up the soldiers of the world wars, in particular, as the epitome of heroism, bravery, and the will to fight injustice. Now, admittedly, all these models are flawed. All right, many Victorian gentlemen, were complicit in awful acts of genocide and colonization. Many medieval knights were bloodthirsty murderers and rapists, and all of these models promoted a traditional gender role that marginalized women and girls, not to mention millennia of sexual abuse and exploitation. All right, I'm not saying that we go back to these models wholesale, but I think it would be ahistorical not to identify and recognize some of the more noble aspects of them, all right? Noble aspects that have suppressed anarchy and fascism and sustained a social order that we're sorely lacking today. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, like, this focus on masculinity is ill-conceived or fraught with issues or contributing to our social ills. Some of you might be thinking that masculinity is the problem, full stop. And when we see images like this, like, I get it. But these men do not represent the values I just described. They don't represent the majority of men in this country. All right, I argue that as long as we have men, we're going to have masculinity. So the question is, how do we create a model of masculinity that's sustainable and positive? What are us fathers, coaches, and teachers willing to do to raise our boys and young men to be decent people? These are questions that I am immensely concerned with because I have a 6-year-old son named Charlie sitting over there somewhere. And one day he's going to be a man. All right, and of course, I want him to be a good man, a decent man, a gentle man. I want him to be the kind of man who's going to adapt with changing times. All right, I want him to be a timeless gentleman, if you will. So in that spirit, I have a message for Charlie as a young man. All right, this is my letter to my son. Dear Charlie, as you grow up and become a young man, you're going to notice that the world is constantly changing, and that includes the role of men in our society. You're going to find that the expectations placed on men, on you someday, are sometimes contradictory, sometimes vague, sometimes counterintuitive. These expectations will be placed on you from all directions: the media, your friends, your family, from me. Ultimately, you need to strive to be an adaptable man who can transition with the times while staying true to your core principles. You need to be a timeless gentleman. This is what that means. First and foremost, you need to have compassion for others, especially those who do not have the same power and privilege as you. You need to be an unapologetic feminist who isn't afraid of a strong woman. You need to be an anti-racist who fights for social justice. You need to support the LGBTQ community's right to dignity and humanity. You need to know that it's okay to protest genocide and condemn terrorism. True men do not relish in the suffering of others. You can be tough and sensitive. They're not mutually exclusive. Second, you should practice equanimity. We're living in an age of grievance where many so-called men pout and throw tantrums over the slightest of slights and nominal threats to their power and privilege. Learn to control your emotions. It is okay to be angry or sad or anxious, but there's a time and a place. Slighted by a coworker, let it roll off your back. Fascism on the rise? Get out there and make some noise. But know this, son, it is okay to talk about your feelings. You can talk to friends, you can talk to a therapist, you can talk to me. But be stoic in public and emotional in private. And never let your feelings manifest in violence or cruelty. Next, be curious. Pursue knowledge and the study of history. Part of being a man is being worldly, being a critical thinker, and being an astute observer. This can be through formal education like college or through informal education, but always be open to learning and always ask questions. Men who cannot think deeply will always be manipulated by the despots and the oligarchs. Men who are ahistorical are doomed to repeat the atrocities of the past. Ignorance is not bliss. It is living in a hellscape of conspiracy theories, paranoia, and hatred. I once walked into your classroom during a math lesson, and you were so enraptured by what you were learning that you were literally on the edge of your seat. Continue to kindle that love for learning. And finally, you need to be a hard work who perseveres through adversity. I dare say you need to have grit. Too many men feel entitled to power and wealth, but they're not willing to work for it. And when they don't get it, they blame others. Women, immigrants, people of color. You are not entitled to anything but your life and your liberty, and you need to work your ass off for the rest. And when you fall, do not blame others. Just get up, adapt, and get after it again. I want to leave you with one last thought. I'm not perfect, and I don't always live up to these values myself, and you won't either. However, the measure of your manliness will be determined by how hard you strive to live by these ideals. Don't pay your principles lip service, and when you slip, get back up and do better. I love you, buddy. Dad, thank you.